welcome to Freethinking 101, a program brought to you each week by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. We offer you an opportunity to examine your prejudices and your biases, to look at your religion and your philosophy, and to look into the deep recesses of your mind and sweep out the cobwebs that are in there. When I was in college, one of my anthropology professors mentioned that religions were invented because of the fear of death on the part of people. And we're going to examine that this evening in a rationalist eschatology. Our speaker is Pat Inniss, who is the president of the Rationalist Society. And that's a big word, eschatology. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Well, actually, eschatology might be a little bit of a, grandiose term to use for what I'm going to be talking about tonight. When people talk about eschatology in the religious and the philosophical context, usually they're referring to what happens to you after you die. Where do you go? You know. Now, what I'd really like to focus on tonight is just the concepts of death, and maybe as rationalists, what our attitudes toward death should be. I don't think they're the same as the attitudes that religious people have had.
Yeah, I think probably we'll have to start out with some of those religious ideas. What are some of the scenarios posed by religion to explain what happens at the time of death?
Well, religions have really made a great effort to explain death, to really satisfy people's curiosity about death and to assuage their fears of death. That's been really one of the primary selling points of religion. And when you look at what the religious view of death is, you can really sort of say it defines, mortality itself defines sort of a dividing line between gods and mortals and us. There's a lot of, of course, just about every religion, I guess you could say every religion, I don't know why I'm mincing words here, has some type of view of what happens to you when you die. In our tradition, of course, we think of death in our religious tradition, the Judaic-Christian religious tradition, you think of death as being a punishment, and that's imposed by God as sort of a vengeance for screwing up.
I like the Islamic version of the afterlife.
Oh, well, yeah, for good people, it's great. Yeah, especially if you die in battle, that's another one of the things that they've done to us is they've used really these views of an afterlife, be it Elysium or Valhalla or heaven, to sort of, in a way, try to take away your fear of death. And this has often been done to for some rather nefarious purposes, as you can see, like you mentioned in the Islamic view. If you died in jihad, the holy war, you'd receive very considerable carnal rewards in the afterlife. Of course, this concept of what the afterlife consists of really tells you a lot about what people's view of the world as it is and what their values are of the world.
Yeah, the Islamic view is rather hard on the women.
Really, in the afterlife, they don't really say too much about the rewards that the women have. It's certainly not. It's not really very similar to what happens to men in the afterlife.
Yeah.
But what I really want to focus on here tonight is just the problem of the way we view death and how that affects our actions in terms of dealing with death. And if you look at in our current society, probably about 3/4 of the people in our society do believe in some form of afterlife.
I've often wondered if they really believe in this.
Well, that's what they say in response to the pollers, the questionnaires anyway. They say that they believe in some form of afterlife. Now this, to me, is sort of like a denial syndrome, because people really fear death above all else, and since they don't really have any solution to it, they sort of deny that it's a problem there. That, I think we're still in that stage.
Yeah. Now, a different group, the philosophers, they have some ideas about death too. Can you tell us a little bit about how some of the philosophers view this?
Yeah, well, I think they want to tie it up into a neat package too, where everything works out. I think some philosophers felt that an afterlife was in some sense logically necessary so that we'd have an opportunity to even the score. So that's a sort of a concept that's held in common with a lot of religious views of life. You try to explain why there's so much injustice in the world, why bad things happen to good people, why good things happen to bad people. They say, well, it all comes out in the end. They'll get theirs in the next world. In case of, if you're the oppressed, amongst some oppressed group, the religions will tell you, the leaders of the oppressing forces will use their religion to tell you that don't worry about it. This is just the world, and in the afterlife everything will be fine.
In the afterlife, you can be the oppressor.
Right. So in the meantime, it's slaves obey your masters.
Yeah.
And but philosophers have had somewhat different views. One of my favorites is Pascal. He was really a dynamite mathematician, but early in his career he really cut it short to delve into philosophy, and he spent a lot of his time, you might say wasted a lot of his time trying to contradict atheist arguments. But he had sort of an idea of his approach to death was, well, gee, he never really succeeded in proving the existence of God, and I guess he probably had some manner of doubt there. But they have this concept of Pascal's wager, which means that, well, I don't really know if there is an afterlife, but it's such a big deal that I'm not going to take the chance. I'm going to live my life as a good Christian and hope for the best. With the idea being that you can. There's a big upside if you're right, and not really much of a downside.
Kierkegaard, I think, had pretty much some of the same ideas, except he was much more militant about it. Mm-hmm. And he believed in this idea of faith, and that in spite of all proofs to the contrary, evidence to the contrary, you still should believe.
He was the leap to faith guy, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, with Pascal, of course, you really have sort of a pragmatist view of it. Now, the problem with Pascal's wager, of course, is with choosing any religion. You don't know if you put all your money on the Christian horse, then it could just be that actually the Muslim God is the one that's really ruling the universe,
Yeah.
So there's really holes in that argument big enough to drive a truck through. And in the meantime, you might be living your life in a way that's really not the best life that you could live.
Yeah. I think you mentioned something earlier about, or not tonight, but something about Joseph Fouché.
Yeah.
He has a thought on the afterlife.
Well, he was a Jacobin back in the age of the Enlightenment, and he went around, in France, and erecting signs that said, "Death is an eternal sleep." Now, this was, his way. I interpret it anyway as his way of defying the authority of the church, of the religionists, and and sort of refuting the central tenet of their religions was that. You could achieve life, everlasting life through Christ or whoever your particular God happened to be.
Yeah.
Just sort of a very, today I guess, for most humanists they would say, well, that's sort of a statement of the obvious, but it was revolutionary in those days.
Yeah. What's the problem you see with all of these views? A lot of people holding different views, but essentially addressing the same problem in the same way.
Well, the problem I see in the belief in an afterlife is it doesn't really orient you toward a solution to what I see as a problem that should be attacked as any other problem. As I think we ought to recognize that death is a problem that we should address, we should be attacking in some organized fashion rather than sort of honoring it as a human tradition. I think these teachings have really programmed us to have an acceptance of death. And like we mentioned before, it comes in handy at sometimes to have people disregard the fear of death if you want them to go charging out of the trenches and into machine gun fire, or if you can convince them that by contributing their funds to some church, they may be presenting themselves with a better opportunity to live a pleasant life in the hereafter. That's it serves that purpose, but. I really think we should consider natural aging and death as just another health problem, like age, like cancer, except with sort of a 100% incidence rate.
Yeah, rather than a problem to be attacked, it can be thought of as a fact that has to be adjusted to.
Yeah. We really need to get away from the acceptance of death that we've been programmed into, and put death out there with all the rest of the problems that face humanity. Now, I keep talking about death. What I'm really talking about is natural death, is the whole aging process. We go through the gradual sort of death on the installment plan that we've all bought into right now in the process of living. And I think freethinkers can sort of be leaders in you know, aiding society to bring about a new
make
view.
an adjustment.
Right.
Yeah. What do you view as the rationalist essential view of death? And can you analyze death from that perspective?
Yeah, well, you can. Death really sort of makes a lot of sense if you look at it from sort of I guess the biological perspective would really be what, you know, the hat you'd need to put on to understand what death is all about. And I view it as sort of nature's plan of natural obsolescence. You know, just as you know, manufacturers make their products to last a limited period of time and provide a certain amount of service before they have to be replaced. This is what nature's done too. It's really a feature of evolution.
Yeah.
If you understand evolution, if you understand natural selection, you can understand how death fits into this whole plan, this process. Evolution is really, you know, the purpose of evolution is to promote the survival of the species, not of the individual. That's the critical point here. The fitness of the species, or really more specifically of the genes that these species carry, is what's important. It's not really the survival of the individuals. There's good examples in nature. If you study various species, the behavior of the species, the lifespan, their biology, how this progresses. You know, my favorite example is a study that was done by a guy named A.D. Blest. He was a English biologist, I believe, who did a study in 5 moth species in Panama. Now, 3 of the species were perfectly camouflaged, and after procreation, after they laid their eggs, they only lived about an average of 13 days. What happened was they would fly themselves to death. You know, after they laid their eggs, they'd just go out and fly like crazy. Okay, and they'd either be exhausted or they'd be picked off by, well, typically a bird. Now there were a couple other species that were vividly colored, but they had a foul taste. Now, what happened with these is after they laid their eggs, they produced a hormone which actually suppressed their urge to fly. So in that case, what would happen was they just sort of hang around, you know, and like light on a tree. And, you know, if a bird happened to come along and see them, he'd pick them off and, you know, eat them, or at least taste them, and then spit them out maybe, because they were vividly colored, but they had a foul taste, which, you know, sort of common in nature.
So the bird would only eat one, and then leave all the rest of them alone.
Right. Well, the point here is that you have the birds that were camouflaged, acting in a way so that, you know, the moths that were camouflaged, flying around and acting in a very unnatural way.
Irrational.
Right. So maybe they got religion, I don't know, right before they died. But so they would attract attention, and the birds would eat them. Okay, and you could think of that as being a way that for every moth that the birds did eat, that it served their purpose in propagating the species. They didn't eat one of the other moths. Okay, and also the birds didn't learn to look for them where they typically hung out.
Yeah.
Now, for the other species that was vividly camouflaged, vividly colored, and foul tasting, they would just sit out there and practically wait for a bird to come and eat them. When the bird did eat them, he learned a lesson. Hey, don't eat these vividly colored moths.
Yeah.
So in this way, what you see is that nature has actually sort of programmed the behavior of these moths, programmed the way that they are to die, so that they serve for the propagation of the species. They serve to protect their offspring, their survivors.
Really 2 different approaches.
Right, right. Now, there's a couple of different arguments about, you know, how death is treated by nature. One argument is that, you know, as in the case of the moths, it's programmed in that we're supposed to die in a certain way. And there's arguments, very strong arguments of that. There's the moth example I just talked about. Some people say that humans have an unusually long lifespan for animals, and part of it is because it takes so long for our youth to mature. And it serves a purpose to have, since humans are so dependent on knowledge, on intelligence for them to manipulate their environment and to survive in the world. It's a selective advantage for the older individuals to live long enough to be both capable of raising the next generation of young, and perhaps the succeeding generation, and also to be able to impart their knowledge to their offspring.
Yeah.
Now, the counter-argument to that is that, well, nature really doesn't care what happens to you after you reproduce.
Yeah.
And the analogy they use in this argument is like a Mars probe. After the probe goes beyond Mars, it served its purpose. Whatever happens to it then is totally at random. So in that instance, it's just as if nature sort of lost interest in the individual and allows their body to gradually decay and die. So regardless of really which way you look at it, it seems obvious that death is really an important and probably necessary facet of the evolutionary process. Yeah. It provides room for the next generation of individuals to come about. It provides, and without this provision of room or provision for new individuals to move in and promote the species and provide new combinations of genes, then you wouldn't have the flexibility, the adaptability that's necessary for for a species to survive. It's a very, very important thing.
Yeah, with the current interest in population explosion, not as much interest as there should be, but with the interest in it, if you can imagine if people were immortal, what the population explosion would lead to.
Well, that's one aspect that's been really dealt with, I guess, humanists have thought about this problem. It's not as if there is something that they haven't thought about. I guess I was preparing for the show. I was reading an article about cryonics, or cryogenic preservation. One of the counter arguments to that is that, well, gee, if everybody did this, we'd have, we'd replace the cemeteries with a bunch of sealed tubes, people in liquid hydrogen or whatever it is, waiting, and it'd be a great drain on society. So there are certain ethical problems involved in the whole question, but my feeling is that this would be such a great boon to humanity. People would be very willing to make whatever sacrifices would be necessary in terms of procreation, having kids. As you know, a lot of people in certain parts of the world have children for the very purpose of caring for them in their old age. Now, if you could ensure these people continued health for us, some unspecified number of years, far beyond what our normal lifespan is, well, that motivation to have children would be entirely removed.
Or if they could develop an adequate social security system, then that would help with that, I think.
Another solution, yes.
Yeah, but there's not that much economic resource available in, I think, a lot of these countries.
Well, that's one of the things. The economic aspects is something I might touch on in terms of being one of the benefits of extended life. Right now, with a lot of the diseases that people are afflicted with are associated with the gradual deterioration of the body which occurs during aging.
Yeah.
And if, one scientist, Bernard Strehler, he was a pretty eminent scientist, has done a lot of work in this area. He had an estimate that if we were all 15 years old, if we all had 15-year-old bodies, had the health of 15-year-olds, then we'd live for an average of 20,000 years. Without if you could eliminate the death from, of course, accidental deaths and stuff like that. We're just talking about death from natural causes. You would have an average lifespan of 20,000 years. Now, that might be, to me, I'm not sure where he came up with the data.
Yeah,
it sounds pretty outlandish.
I know that back at the turn of the century, and of course earlier than that, people died at, the average age was 40, average lifespan. And that was because there were a lot of these acute illnesses that killed people off. But the scientific applications to medicine has eliminated many of these acute illnesses. But the chronic illnesses, when you get older, they still will get you at this point. So that raised the lifespan to the beginning 70s, or around 74 or so. So from 40 to 74 is quite an advance. They're finding it more difficult to advance beyond that because the chronic illnesses are much more difficult to work with. But who knows? One wonders what the limit is to the scientific approach to immortality, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, well, there are very definite limits. What we're talking about here when we say immortality, I guess what we're talking about are virtual immortality. We don't mean that if you step out in front of a truck, you won't be killed. We're really talking about really significant improvements in longevity. We're talking about extending longevity. And, what we have to do is, what they are doing now is studying a lot of the mechanisms by which the aging process occurs, and there's really a lot of information that's available out there. There's several models and explanations for how aging occurs, but they're almost like the theories about the reasons behind the disappearance of the dinosaurs. One of the things we know is that the somatic body cells, not the sex cells, the reproductive cells, but the somatic body cells can reproduce about 50 times maximum from the time of conception.
Now, I heard it was 7.
It depends. It depends. There's.
But I think my 7 is your 50, so I'm not sure.
Well, I think this is a sort of a typical cell. Some of the cells will reproduce more often. Some will reproduce, like nerve cells in the central nervous system, won't reproduce at all.
Yeah.
They're fixed. The number you're born with is the number you die with. Epithelial cells, like the cells from the lining of your stomach wall, will reproduce every few days. They'll split, and they're constantly replacing themselves.
I think I read somewhere recently that they have been able to take some brain cells from a fetus and install them in a living person to the benefit of that person. Now, I don't know much more than that about what I read, but there seem to be continual efforts to not only lengthen life, but to make it better. And I would not want to be immortal and have Alzheimer's disease in the process.
Well, that's one of the walls that they're really going to hit when they try to extend lifetime, biological life, beyond the normal lifespan for humans, say 120 years, is the brain. The brain tends to deteriorate over a period of time. These cells don't replace themselves, and some extremely old individuals, by the time they die, only have about 25% of their brain cells in their cerebral cortex, the most important part of the brain that sort of distinguishes you from.
One thing that I found fairly explanatory is if I think of the human body like an automobile, parts will get pretty bad and you can replace those parts. There's some parts of the human body that can be replaced, but eventually your car dies. You know what I mean? And the human body, I think it's a good analogy.
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, trying to understand what makes the car wear. Some scientists tend to think that they can actually slow down the aging process through chemical manipulation of the environment of the body of the cell. One theory has it that free radicals are responsible, and radicals are sort of these unattached molecules drifting around with spare electrons waiting to.
Maybe we can get into eugenics on this too, and find people that are more likely to live longer and so on. We do that with the other animals. We breed them for certain things.
Well, that's one thing I might mention. We were talking about evolution earlier. And evolution for human beings and eugenics, in a sense, is almost a dead issue because of the, right on the horizon, it's easy to see that we're going to be into genetic engineering in the very near future. And human beings, in the course of natural evolution, have probably evolved as far as they're ever going to get. From here on out, it looks like it's genetic engineering, which really is going to be the process by which we're going to achieve, I think, the ultimate extension of lifespan through a change in the human biology on the genetic level.
I read something too about the development of artificial intelligence as a way of doing this. That'll leave human beings in the dust, but that's another topic sometime. What role do you think free thought can play in revising our attitudes toward death? And will life extension affect religious thought?
Well, I think it will. If you look at the problem again, you come back to, you could say, well, here again you see that religion is the opium of the people, where you have a problem out there such as death, but it's not being really attacked in a systematic way, largely because of, I think, the influence of religious thinking. So religion has really achieved, one thing it's achieved is giving people sort of an artificial inner tranquility and preventing them from really dealing with this problem. It's going to come, though. I think it's, as we, sort of stumble our way toward a solution to this problem, eventually people will realize, that it will be within their grasp, and at that point there'll be more of an organized, concerted effort to solve the problem of aging. And this is going to present a serious threat to one of the main attractions of religion.
What about free thought, though? How does that? relate to this?
Well, what we can do, I think, is sort of serve as perhaps the vanguard, if you will, of leading people toward what I would feel would be a more profound understanding of death and an acceptance of death for what it is, and deal with it in rational terms rather than, in a sense, a rejection of death, a rejection of the reality of death, clinging to a fantasy that death isn't what it really appears to be. The most profound statement about death I could come up with is, when you're dead, you're dead.
Yeah. You only go around once, they say in the commercials. And I think that's pretty much true.
I guess one problem that they have is that, it's sort of like playing God. It's interpreted as playing God. As a matter of fact, one of the authors, Alan Harrington, had a book called The Immortalist. The subtitle of that was An Approach to Engineering Man's Divinity.
Yeah.
And I can see a lot of religionists rising out of their seats
Yeah.
on a cloud of steam when they hear that.
Okay, well, Pat, I want to thank you for giving us expanding our horizons a little bit in this area, because it's something we all face, death, and it's something we all have to think about. And I hope we have given those of you in our audience something to think about in this respect. If you'd like to get in touch with us about some thoughts on this, you can write to us, the Rationalist Society, Box 2931, St. Louis 63130, or if you wish, give us a telephone call. Write down this number, 298-6649. We would like to hear from you, and if you have suggestions for future programs, we would like to hear about those too. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.